I think you should now be able to see my front slide. If not, shout.
Yeah, we can see them.
Fabulous. So yes, I'm reflecting today on the EEF's Cognitive Science in the Classroom review with a particular focus on translation. My name's Tom. I work at the University of Warwick. I was at the University of Birmingham when I was working on this review. I've very recently moved. I had the absolute privilege of leading this absolutely fabulous team of people. If you recognise any names on here, you'll know what I'm talking about when I say this is such an interesting, thoughtful and diverse group with experts in the cognitive science, but also education policy, practice, review methodology, and I've learned a lot along the way. I'm talking about translation today, but I just want to give a really brief overview of some of the things from the review itself, just as a introduction to that. We set out, we have a big protocol and lots of technical ways of saying this, but fundamentally, we wanted to know whether cognitive science works in real classrooms, across the curriculum, and for different pupil groups. And it's the second half of that that's particularly thorny. The cognitive science techniques might work, but do they work in real classrooms? They work in different subjects for different ages of pupils. That's the thing that was really tricky about this review and where we focused in. In overview, we had 8 areas of cognitive science that we looked at. Some of these are immediately familiar to people. So things like spaced learning, interleaving, retrieval practice are right at the heart of some of the sort of practice-facing, if you like, cognitive science, which we see. Other categories were a bit more pragmatic, like number 5, working with schemas. We put this together from some, it was kind of data-driven. We had some studies which were informed by cognitive science, which were related to elaborating and improving schemas, which we put together in this group. In total, we had 8 areas. We identified 14 strategies that we were in a position to test. We had sufficient amount of evidence to do a kind of formal assessment of their impact. And in total, for each of the strategies, we conducted a systematic review of classroom trials for effectiveness. And for each of the areas, all 8 of them, we had these large discussion sections, which we called evidence-informed discussion and questions, where we brought together lots of things. The database itself, we brought together lots of practice-facing guidance and reports. And we also did some interviews and surveys of teachers, which we brought their perspectives and voices into that section to talk about the theory and practice of each of the strategies. As I say, this is it's not my focus to go over the main findings of that, but if you are interested, we have a very large sort of 250-page or so report. We have a summary report of around 40 pages, if that's a little bit too intense. We also have a preview talk from me where I overview some of the results. There's a link there. And for those who just want to dip their toe in the water here, there's a summary Twitter thread of some of the main things we see when we look at the applied cognitive science. So let me summarize the headlines. We had about 7 or 8 findings in total, but I think we can boil this down to 2 main headline overview findings from the big picture of the review. The first one is simply that we felt there was strong enough evidence in the classroom to say, yes, cognitive science matters. The findings we got were mostly in line with what would be expected from cognitive science theories and principles. We saw appreciable differences in the rates of learning in line with these theories. We think that teachers should look to access cognitive science and understand what it means for them and have a working knowledge of cognitive science. And there's potential here, the education system, of taking cognitive science on board and working out what it means within policy and practice in education. So this is a really positive message. The second finding, also true, although it feels slightly contradictory, is to say that the applied evidence is actually far more limited than the basic science. It's more complex and it's less positive. So we can identify lots of problems and challenges and complications within the report, which we might want to think about as we get the findings into practice. I was speaking at Research Ed earlier this year, and I had a conversation with Bradley Bush afterwards, whether anyone knows him, but he said, Tom, your review, it's a bit like that dress. Remember that dress where some people saw blue and black and some people saw white and gold? He says, your review is just like that. Some people see number one, some people see number two, and they can read something very different from the same report. But these are both true. And as a result, a lot of the conversations that came after the report tended to be about the gaps there. What does this mean that we don't have any evidence for this subject or this age range? What does it mean? How does that look in my subject? How do I translate that? What does that look like in my context? So these are questions that came out of the conversations and the review itself. So that's why today I'm talking about translation, to try and explore some of those questions. So looking at this at a big picture level, we have the basic cognitive science, and we might say that that is concerned fundamentally, it's concerned fundamentally with the fundamentals of learning. It's about the basic principles of cognition, which are likely to apply in most learning across most contexts. It's looking for things which are likely to apply in most contexts. And of course, it uses controlled conditions to establish these findings, which will have wide applicability. When we look at the applied cognitive science, if we could maybe capture this in a word, it might be the word realistic. We're trying to see whether things work in everyday conditions, for whom and in what circumstances things work. And again, just to reinforce the message here, the big picture is that we have a huge wealth of evidence on the basic science front, and we have a lot of confidence in several decades of results around some of the core findings. And I know there's lots of new innovative areas and debates going on around additional things, but some of the core principles here are well established. When we look at the applied cognitive science, in contrast, we've got far less to work with. So that's one of the messages here. And so I think for school teachers in England and people looking at the education world and cognitive science, when we see a lot of cognitive science, what we're actually seeing is people who are interpreting and translating from the basic science rather than from the applied science. And I say that in a really positive sense, that there's some really expert teachers, there's some great practice-focused cognitive scientists who are thinking really carefully about what this might mean in a practical context, and they're doing that translation and interpretation. But it's different to say that the evidence doesn't support it we don't have realistic field experiments which support any particular translation and interpretation. We don't have evidence to back any particular instance of that. And so that's one of the things I'll explore a little bit of what this gap is and how we can bridge it and where the evidence lies within it. So one way perhaps of bringing this message home a little bit is some of the conversations I had after the report was, well, there is actually quite a lot of the basic science which actually is in the classroom. It's not just in the laboratory. There's this stereotype that the basic science is all laboratory, it's all very artificial. But actually, I think there's some really sort of more practice-facing basic science which is still in the classroom. But I still think there's a distinction to be made here. So this is how I would try and delineate the two. In our original review, the EEF Cognitive Science in the Classroom review, we set a very low bar for inclusion in terms of realism. We said that it had to be in a classroom. For children 3 to 18, it had to be in a classroom. And that of course, includes quite a lot. In total, we had about 202 studies once we've grouped them into the strategies with that particular criteria. So during, I think it was about August, I was talking to people about this, and I went back to the review database to say, well, what if we set the bar a little higher? What if we wanted slightly more realism within the studies that we had? Let's add some extra criteria. The first one, if we looked at the EEF review database and say that we want only studies which have 100 or more pupils. There are lots of small studies in here. What would we be left with? Well, we'd be left with 143 studies out of the original 202. So we'd lose quite a few there. And the next one, and this is the big one, what if we said that the study had to be delivered by teachers, or it had to have more than just minimal involvement from the teachers? If we added that criteria to the studies in the database, we've dropped from 202 to 46. We've only got 46 studies which have been primarily delivered by teachers in their own classroom. We then go further and say, well, maybe the intervention has to be at least 3 weeks. These 2-week studies of the intervention, we want 3 or more weeks because that's more realistic. And we're left with 25 studies. This is in the, as I say, this is the EEF review database with these additional criteria. And when you start to look at that across our areas, you can start to see how thinly the evidence is spread in terms of realistic studies. Across the 8 areas, we're down to a very small handful of studies which have been tested in these conditions, the original in the classroom condition, as well as these larger studies delivered by teachers or primarily, and larger than 3 weeks. And the thing that's really, really stark here is number 3 jumps out to me, retrieval practice, because I know that evidence base for retrieval practice is huge. And the evidence base for retrieval practice in the classroom is huge. And there's some really good reviews of this. But it's these additional things, and especially the one around teachers, which has knocked out a lot of these studies to take an area which is incredibly strong in the basic science to one which is really, really weak when it comes to what, at least what I'm defining as the applied science. And from an educational application point of view, the first thing you think about when you're trying to improve education is how we're going to teach better, what teachers are going to do. They are the main agent of change in our system. So knowing how teachers do things with cognitive science is pretty central to getting things into practice. Yet the science has sort of gone round the teachers. The second thing we often think about when we're trying to apply things in education is how they play out across different pupil groups and how they play out across different subjects. So again, this is based on some of the conversations I had afterwards, and I've brought together the information in the report about the different strategies and where they do and don't have evidence. So if you look down this list here, these are the 14 strategies we reviewed. The second column is the age coverage, and the third column is the subject coverage. And I've coloured in green the areas where I felt there was really good coverage by age and by subject. And you can see there are some in green, some I put in light green because it wasn't great, but it was okay. All the blue areas of the report here are areas where the evidence is restricted to a particular key stage. So key stage 3 would be sort of 11 to sort of 14-year-olds, or a particular subject like maths and science. We have some evidence from the early years, but not so much. We have some evidence in English, but less. And again, this is problematic when we think about how this might play out in the education system. So, well, I'm going to put my tongue in my cheek slightly, and I almost feel a bit paranoid that I might have missed part of my research methods training, or maybe I fell asleep in one of my lectures in Research Methods 101. I must have missed this little bit where the lecturer told us all that you should really avoid applied research and you should try and avoid being too realistic about things. So what I've done here is I've looked through the EEF database and I've reverse engineered, if you like, this missing bit of the lecture that I must have fallen asleep for. I think it went something like this. So the lecturer must have said, well, it's a really complex, messy world out there, and you can find yourself with null findings or great confusion. So how to avoid this and keep yourself safe? You might want to follow the following advice. First, if you do something in a single school, this will help if you do across separate schools. Sometimes it works in one, not others, and that context makes things a bit messy. This is the most important piece of advice. Whatever you do, don't let the teachers deliver it. Teachers have their own ideas, they change things, they don't do things properly, it's not standardized. Don't let the teachers involved. Number 3, if you do have to have the teachers deliver something, try and use a booklet or a computer program, or maybe a scripted lesson, because you'll be able to standardize it that way and minimize that impact of the teacher. And I'm going to stop being humorous about this now. There's a serious set of points here about some of the things which have been controlled in the study in order to reach those fundamentals, that basic science principles of what works for cognition. But some of these controls are quite problematic when you're looking at it from an educational standpoint. This one here about not letting students and teachers interact. Well, the interaction is pretty central to what we understand to be classroom practice. There were studies which teachers were told if a student put their hand up and asked something, they weren't allowed to respond. They had to redirect them to the booklet that they were using, because otherwise it might contaminate the intervention, or students had to work alone on things. You had lots of studies which were supervised heavily by researchers or delivered by researchers. We had lots of studies where the teachers were experts of some kind. They were a PhD researcher, they were a research enthusiast, or a kind of very, as far as we could tell, expert teacher delivering the intervention. Interventions were short. Some of them were pulled out of the classroom environment in small groups, even if they were in a classroom. And some of the comparison conditions, they were designed to be quite distinct conditions rather than exploring a middle ground. They were designed in single ability groups or with entirely new content, so not to have the previous learning undermine the kind of newness of the learning. And a lot of it was researcher designed tests rather than curriculum-based tests or standardized tests. And this big list here is very understandable, but I would describe it as the blind spots of research at the moment. So I think looking at this as a researcher, I wish we had more funding and a kind of emphasis on trying to figure some of these things out in a more scientific, more robust context. Looking at this as an educator, I think we should see it as the blind spots of the research that we as educators need to work our way through. So as an example here, this sort of halfway down point here about making sure teachers are experts. Well, I think this has implications for our thinking about whether cognitive science is different for trainee teachers or early career teachers, as opposed to highly expert teachers. Is there a different message which is needed for these? Are there different strategies which are more or less important? I think when we think about the interactions, this is another one which comes in. So this is a list of things which I think we need to work through if we wish to translate research effectively. So let me go a bit further into this. You might remember back in this slide here, one of the categories in our study which stands up best to this test of realism was this bottom category of mixed strategy programs. The mixed strategy programs were, by their nature, they were designed to be realistic applications of cognitive science. They were really big studies done over many, many schools. So you can look down this list here and see there are lots and lots of students, thousands rather than dozens or hundreds. You still see the same limitations. It's science, yes, and it's 7th, 8th grade, yes. But nonetheless, these were some of the best studies in our entire review in terms of a really realistic test of cognitive science. They brought together several strategies, usually a few of this list: space practice, worked examples, concept comparisons, dual coding, visualization exercises. They often had 2 or 3, sometimes 4 of these. And they built them into the curriculum, they built them into professional development and learning, and they tested them out at scale. And from these results, the most positive one, Cromley et al., tested their intervention across 6 curriculum units. And of those, 2 had a moderate positive effect. 4 were not statistically significant. They were small. 1 of them was negative. Davenport and Yang found positive but small and not statistically significant effects. And Shun et al. Found small positive to small negative, a range of effects, mostly not statistically significant. Looking at this overall, I actually don't think this is as bad as it looks. I think what this suggests is when you do it at scale, instead of getting these large effect sizes you get in the basic science of 0.8 or something, you end up with a small 0.1 maybe. But if you do that at scale, that still matters, that's still important, even if it didn't cross this threshold for statistical significance. It suggests that you do get a small benefit from this. But it also suggests that lots of potential is being lost here, that we potentially could get more out of cognitive science if we could translate it a little better. And one of the really interesting things is when someone spends millions of pounds on a trial and researchers set out and test it, and then it doesn't work as well as people might have hoped, you get some real soul searching in the discussion sections. You get researchers think, oh, why didn't this work as well as we would have hoped? And suddenly people get very candid and very honest and very introspective and thoughtful when they get to their discussion sections. And you can look through the discussion sections of these papers and see some really interesting points about what didn't work as well as they would have hoped. And you can see things like this idea that the classroom is a complex and dynamic system over months and years, and teachers need to integrate and apply a variety of principles all together in the system. Practitioners often struggle to interpret and integrate these abstract principles into their everyday instruction. And instructional design is ultimately a form of engineering. It's moving research into practice, integrating, applying. We see these words again and again. Similarly with Yang, I think this is, again, insightful and good advice. The teachers might have benefited more if they'd been offered a more direct experience with the optimal learning environment they're expected to construct. So they actually are immersed and experience the classroom conditions which are being proposed. That teachers' starting points as well seem important, that what they learn is based largely on their existing knowledge, and what they take away depends on their starting point. So we need diagnostics for teachers here in terms of what they get from cognitive science. And teachers need to address particular circumstances, knowledge, and their experience. Personalizing professional development to that is important. And so this brings me on to translation and how we might think about it. So earlier today, I was thinking about the word translation. And I was thinking, what other words do we use in education? We sometimes use the word implement. The EEF have an implementation guide with advice on how school leaders and teachers can implement evidence-based strategies. So to implement is to start using a plan or a system, according to the dictionary. We might, this one's less common, but it's another word I'm trying to think of in my thesaurus for getting things in place. We transplant, we can move or transfer into another place. We might integrate, to form or coordinate or blend into a functioning or unified whole. We unite things. We can incorporate, to again take something into the part, or as a part of a whole, to include it in. We embed it, to fix an object firmly or deeply in a surrounding mass. And we might translate it, to put it into a different language or form or interpret it. Looking down this list, I think that the first two are probably the worst, have the worst connotations here and the worst way of thinking about how we get things into practice. To implement really focuses just on the project, on the thing itself and getting that in. It doesn't encounter the rest of the system. In the way of transplanting, I get this image of someone getting an organ and shoving it into a surgeon putting a new organ into your body. It's like it's inserting something into the whole without necessarily connecting things up. So I look through this list, and the ones that really feel right to me are these things about unified whole. It's creating a unified whole that matters. It's integrating things or fixing it deeply and firmly into the surroundings. And then I think translate is another good metaphor here of turning it to a different language. It needs to be converted from the ideas and principles to something that resembles what teachers do, what they say, what they do, what they create, and the environment in their classrooms. So, I mean, that's just to kind of look at the language. To answer the question very precisely of what are we integrating into when we integrate, my answer to that would be that teachers have a schema of teaching, of classroom practice, of learning, of their subject. It's teaching and learning, which we need to integrate it into. And so what does that look like? It's a difficult thing to describe, and if we had a trainee teacher, we would probably put them in the classroom and start observing it. It's something that you show rather than tell to a large extent. But we do have good models, I think, of teaching and learning. So maybe not a good model, but in the EEF report, we set out lots of things that might affect different strategies, thinking about how they play out in the classroom. We made this big list of things, and just to simplify that, essentially we have things to do with the teachers and the teaching, things to do with the classroom and the social environment. We had student individual factors, which were potentially different for every individual student. And we have things to do with the activity, the topic and the subject, and the stage of learning within them that the lesson has reached. And we thought some of these were factors to consider. So I think cognitive science needs to be integrated into this system. And to add to that, that not only do all these things matter and the principles behind them, but they all interact with each other in a kind of complex and dynamic way. So it's integrating into that is the trick. Other really good models out there. There's an excellent review called The Great Teaching Toolkit, done fairly recently. It has a good overview of some evidence-based approaches to teaching and strategies that teachers use. So there's 4 general areas here, and there's lots of subpoints in here. I don't want to go into the detail, but the point is this is a model of teaching, and if we want cognitive science to work, we need to integrate it into this. Similarly, School of Effectiveness Research has identified factors of effective teaching, and there's good reviews and books and accounts of this. This is where I go to in terms of what gets integrated in what. Finally, if you're a school leader, you'll be thinking at a slightly bigger scale. Again, this is just an example, but this is the Ofsted criteria for a school. So it's not the best model of school effectiveness. It's an evaluation model, of course. But again, we need to think how cognitive science plays out across these areas of curriculum delivery and teaching and learning and assessment and curriculum design. This is the space in which we need to work. And so that's my answer to what are we integrating into. So the final part of this presentation is I wanted to get into something a little bit more concrete in terms of an example. So I'm picking retrieval practice as an example because it's, I'd say, one of the most readily accessible strategies we might pick up, and has a really strong evidence base that we should. But even with this fairly sort of simple strategy, I think there's quite a lot still to think through. I could have picked something like interleaving and told you all the things that teachers told us about interleaving when we interviewed them, and how little they felt they and others understood it, and how hard they had to work with it. And again, I'm not saying you can't think through interleaving. I'm saying retrieval practice is probably one of the more readily accessible. So what do you need to do to translate and apply, implement, integrate retrieval practice? First, I think you need a really good understanding of the principles behind it. And there's some really good accounts out there of that, and I'm not going to repeat them now. But for example, I think here's the famous Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. You have to see as a teacher that learning sort of decays over time. You don't retain things permanently, and you have to keep revisiting material in order to hold on to it. It's a really important, powerful principle, and it should have huge implications for how we organise education. So this is important, and it's a good starting point. We can add to that, there's a very specific distinction here between retrieval and forms of restudy, that we find that it's retrieving information from our memory, it's testing ourselves on things, which is more powerful than just revising it, restudying it, rereading it. So there's tests of, are students better off rereading their lecture notes, or are they best testing themselves? So it's the testing effect that's important here too. So these are really important principles. So where do we go from here? How do we connect these up to things? So let's think about some of the things a teacher might think about within their classroom and what they might integrate this with. First, I think there's a really important thing about content. As I've said, teaching is a subject-specific activity that teachers at some point need to contextualize general pedagogical strategies for their own subject expertise and knowledge. They need to know what it looks like, not just in geography, but in rivers or in oxbow lakes. It has to be that granular to get it working. You need to know what questions you need to ask within a retrieval test. And part of the difficulty or the I suppose the expertise needed to do that really well is to see that most subjects have organized knowledge. They have a schema or a episteme, I think is the technical word here. There's a body of knowledge which has more central and less central ideas. You can see in the middle some of the core ideas, the fundamental ideas in your subject represented by this blue dot, some important ideas by the yellow dots, and then you've got more distal, more peripheral ideas by the red dots. As a teacher, I think to do retrieval practice well, you need to be able to identify those yellow and blue central points and make sure that they're the ones which you focus in on. And partly it's just a matter of practicalities, that you just don't have time to quiz everyone every day, every lesson on potentially hundreds and hundreds of questions. And partly it's that you're actively constructing and supporting students to construct their understanding. You also have other things to think through. There is an unresolved, as far as I can see, debate about the extent to which a retrieval quiz or test should vary the content and the questions. There seems to be some people saying that you should keep it as similar as possible because that helps you retain the memory, it strengthens the memory better. But other people seem to think that elaboration or slight changes in the context or the wording is a helpful way of expanding the knowledge. As a teacher, I'd be thinking about whether I change my question types and content. And I think there's also something really important about the difficulty level. And in particular, I would want to link retrieval practice to feedback practice. Teachers have to, on a moment-by-moment basis often, try and have either intuitive grasp or specific information about what students do and don't know. So we call it formative assessment or assessment for learning, formative feedback. And bringing that to retrieval, when we give a retrieval question, students can know the answer to it. They can not know the answer to it and fail to retrieve, or they potentially could retrieve a misconception to that answer. And again, I'm not entirely sure from what I've read within the review, but it seems that having high rates of retrieval is a good thing for efficiency. Low rates of, if you just fail to retrieve, this is just inefficient, but probably not harmful. And if you're retrieving misconceptions again and again, it might be actively harmful approach to using retrieval. And teachers report to us that they do some kind of retrieval activity, and then they find that some of the students know the answer and some didn't, and they have decisions to make about whether they stop their lesson and reteach something and address a misconception. They think about which questions they ask and the pitch and how hard it is they are, whether they differentiate it by their groups. So there's a real set of ideas there about how teachers differentiate their retrieval practice. And I'm not going to go into more detail on these really, but people talk to us about motivation, test anxiety. It seems it can go either way. When students get used to being tested, it makes them less anxious, but sometimes the anxiety can reduce their motivation or their willingness to want to do it. So there is a student experience there. The type of retrieval activity we get, there's some really good information on this on some of the basic science reviews, which suggest that different types of retrieval activity are more effective than others. So teachers might need to contextualize that for their subject. And not to mention, workload and planning and classroom management, and everything else you have to think about while doing your lesson. So that's my example of the kind of considerations, just briefly for one strategy. Back to the kind of more general picture here. What we have in retrieval practice is a situation where, I've got about 5 minutes left, haven't I? We've got a situation where what we've got is at the top a very general finding that just retrieval per se strengthens memory. And we start to make that more specific. Teachers are working downwards, moving towards the concrete and the specific, and researchers tend to be moving in the other direction. So we go from retrieval works to retrieval practice works. You can retrieve something just informally as part of your daily life or in reading a book, but retrieval practice is a specific strategy. Then we take it into specific subjects and age ranges, learning conditions. We move into specific teaching and learning activities for specific learning objectives and content, and for specific classroom conditions with the teacher's experiences and their expertise, with the pupils' prior knowledge, with the pupils' motivation, with the relationships that you have in the classroom. And a teacher, you might say, well, you might year 4 maths lesson on fractions on Tuesday morning delivered to a specific class, or me working with a target group. You're thinking this through in that kind of detail, and maybe right down into that specific moment with a specific pupil on a specific question during retrieval practice. Teachers work that way and researchers work that way. And the point around the evidence is that the evidence sits mostly at number 1 and 2, right at the top. That's where we have really strong evidence about retrieval practice, which we can really trust in. And we know that there's something important here. But where the evidence starts to run out is around number 3. And this is where this translation is happening, that we've got to get from this retrieval practice works down to the 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And this is where the interpretation and translation is happening. It's creative, it's excellent work from cognitive scientists and teachers at the moment happening in this space, but at the moment we haven't tested it in realistic conditions. And I'm sort of closing up with almost some questions of my own here, looking at some of this. So I suppose one question to pose, which I don't know the answer to, is how much can we demand of research here? My assumption is that there's some useful work to be done around this middle space for applied research or maybe practitioner research around this area. And my assumption is right when we get to the bottom, it really does come down to teacher professional learning and their practice development. But I don't quite know where to draw the line. Where can the research stop? And what's that middle space? And how cautious should we be in our generalizations when we don't have evidence down into this middle territory? And another thing is as well, it's a kind of reflection on this, is I suppose there's a temptation to think that we could sit around a table with maybe teachers and researchers, and we could work out some of these problems, and we could come to a really detailed understanding of it. And I think that's true to some extent. But there's a project I did fairly recently where we were talking to school leaders, and they were talking to us about retrieval practice. And this really standout quote springs to mind. So a school leader, she said, "I suppose the risk is that the purity of the research becomes slightly distorted the further it goes into different areas of the school. You might go into art and find something that you said about retrieval practice looks completely different, and suddenly you're not 100% sure whether it's the same thing anymore." And I really get this from talking to teachers and leaders, that they're not just sure even if it's actually an example of the thing they're trying to achieve, and certainly not whether it's a good one or not. There's some really complex expert stuff to figure out here. So, as I say, I'm sort of drawing to a close on my sort of talk here. And again, I'm posing questions at you here really rather than the other way around. But I think some of the questions which I think are unresolved. The first is this question about how much to demand of research and how cautious should we be when there are gaps in it. The second is, I think there's a more practical question about the level of prescription and standardization we need. I speak to some school leaders who say, well, actually, I think it is reasonable for me to say that retrieval practice or cognitive science should be evident in some form, but they're not quite sure where to draw the line and how prescriptive, and at what point do you override a professional judgment which might be contrary to something in the science? How much standardization do we need in what we provide, especially across subjects? Another question is about how much we demand of teachers. So I've sort of given similar talks to this and conversations about it, where and rightly, I think, have been accused of over sort of intellectualizing this. I've sort of tried, come up with the theory of this and talking through it. And actually, teachers, it's about experimenting and trying things out in the classroom. And perhaps I'm asking too much, and maybe we can just keep it simple and just do more retrieval practice and work from there. So we don't have to think this all through all at once. We can work it out incrementally. I suppose there's another question about the development of behavior change. How many cognitive science strategies can you just do, where you just pick it up one day and you do it and you carry on doing it? How many of them need work, and what kind of work? And how can we support teachers through developing that and achieving that? And finally, how serious are the problems in the research base? What can we make of those? Actually, it's not finally. The final is, and how much here is new? When we relate this back to more traditional ways of talking about learning, how much commonality is there between, say, scaffolding from Bruner and cognitive load? I think there are really important differences there, but how much is new here? And this is a question which teachers have posed at me, and I don't fully know the answer to it. Okay, thank you so much for listening. I'm really happy to be here and part of some questions and some discussion.
Thanks so much, Tom. It was a really interesting and valuable talk. So we've got a bit of time for questions now. If anyone would like to ask a question themselves, you can raise your virtual hand if you go to the reactions tab at the bottom, and we'll invite you to come and ask your question, or you can put them into the chat as well. I know we've got a couple of questions in the chat already. One from Gaia and one from Dave. I don't know if any of you would like to ask yourself, but I'll read Gaia's out for now. So it says, how many of the programs that include teachers do you see where some time is spent explaining the constructs that can be flexible and can be adapted, and those that are crucial to keep constant? If I remember correctly, the EEF commissioned a review of complex interventions that by definitions cannot be scripted. Maybe there's some learnings there. So I think the first part was about how many studies do you see where context is really considered and it's explained what needs to be kept constant and what can be variable, and then a question about.
So in terms of what studies there are very few studies that do this, at least the ones that we reviewed. Where I think we might learn something is actually outside of, remember, within the context of our systematic review, we were looking for randomized controlled trials, we were looking for robust tests here. I think actually, if we'd had more resources and time, we might have gone to some case study work or some other evaluation work, which would have got more of an answer to this. I've been in contact with a school in Melbourne, no, not Melbourne, in Queensland, Australia, and they've created a learner toolkit, and they're working through some of these problems, and they've got an article which I think is coming out in the Review of Education, and that explores quite a lot of this. I feel I don't have a very good answer here for you in terms of which are flexible and which should be adapted. But I suppose the answer would be that it's about being really, really clear on what those core principles are, finding out what those non-negotiables are within the principles, and then the things that are flexible is the specific manifestation of that in a practice. So I would say with retrieval practice, for example, I think it's non-negotiable that you revisit ideas, and also it's non-negotiable that you, well, maybe not quite non-negotiable, but it's a really strong principle that you should be testing rather than just revising. But when you get to the specific form of the test, or the specific questions or the specific content, that's where I think we would need to be really flexible. That's where it comes, the subject expertise, the teaching expertise, the knowledge of the context really matters.
Thumbs up from Gaia. Yeah. So there's a question from Dave Bowman as well, asking about brain plasticity, and asking if any studies have been done on the benefits of teachers and children being made aware of brain plasticity in terms of the ability, its relevance to learning.
Yes, and I see within the comment as well, there's a point about growth mindset here. Now, when it gets to brain plasticity and axons, this is out of my comfort zone to say anything about. But when it comes to the growth mindset, I've sort of kept an eye on this set of trials over several decades now, which have sort of tested this out, and occasionally I'll notice that there's a study which says, oh, growth mindset works, we should all do it. And then 6 months later, there's another study which says, growth mindset doesn't work. And it's gone back and forward a little bit. I think a fairly recent one, I think it was in Nature. It was a really big, heavy hitter journal, I think. And I think we've got to a point where I think we can say growth mindset in the right conditions. I think it might be for essentially pupils who need that particular support. There's actually something to address there in terms of their mindset. That's where it has the impact. So if we just do a general intervention for growth mindset, it only works for some of the children, and we don't actually get a general impact of it. So I would say there is something there in growth mindset from what I can tell, but I'm just a casual observer of that. And as I say, I can't really comment on the underlying, but it is worth saying that I think some schools are going to students with teaching the students about cognitive science. And so I'm really interested if anyone's got anything to say on which particular things are really helpful for students to know about how the brain works.
Dave, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, thanks very much, Tom. Yeah, I didn't want it really to be distracted into the growth mindset one, from the point of view that I see the brain plasticity is a fundamental biological principle, which actually then does underlie why growth mindset works as a psychological one. So, but for me, if I explain the brain and learning occurs through basically axons and myelin growing and making connections, then that seems a fundamental thing underlying all these retrieval practices and interleave and everything else. And what I was wondering is how many people even talk about brain plasticity in schools, and if they do, is there any effect on that? Because certainly my anecdotal experience is when you explain it to someone, they sort of go, haha, I see why it's a good idea that I practice every day doing something, or I practice and such like. So I just wondered what was going on there, or if anything was going on. Thank you.
If I could sort of follow up on that, I think, as I said, there is an increasing amount of teachers who want to share some of this with students, and I would again feed this into a wider system of pupil motivation. So there are lots of things which motivate pupils, and some of them, maybe, say in your example there, it's the intellectual argument that you explain to them, this is how your brain works, this is how you learn best, and they say, aha, and that motivates them. Some students are more motivated by social things, so it might be less effective, and actually it's about the kind of social reward of having a good relationship with them that's important. So I think it depends on the student. And just as a little anecdote here, some years ago now, I was teaching supply in Birmingham, and I came to a primary school, and I had one of the older year groups, I think it was year 5, and someone gave me a lesson. It was on neuroscience, and so I had these slides on axons and neurons and things, and I was showing them to year 5 and year 6, and I had very little understanding of it at the time, but I was sort of working my way through the materials. The students found it really, really interesting. I'm not sure whether it translated into their learning strategies, and again, I suspect there's a little bit of work to do to say, this is why the brain works, and that's why you should do your learning like this. I think it's what are the implications, and it's those we need to hammer home, I think. But that study I mentioned as well in Australia, they found that if they told the students lots of the cognitive science, that didn't affect things, and students were continuing to do strategies that they knew weren't effective. It was only when they embedded them into the curriculum, it's embedded them into things they were doing, that they started to en masse start to really work with it.
Thanks. We've got a couple more questions in the chat box here. If people would like to turn their cameras on, ask themselves, you're very welcome to, but I'll just read this out for now. So Paul Winter's asking, have any studies of the research, have any of the research studies looked at whether explaining to the students what is being tried out makes a difference or not? So whether the rationale behind the intervention or the study is actually explained to the students.
So I think this is a fairly, it follows on almost from the last question. Again, I think that the point is, I think there are studies out there, but they wouldn't have been within our systematic review. So I think there would be information out there. And also I think there's, if you can find them, teachers and leaders who are doing this and would be able to give you a more direct answer. And actually, one of the ways I know a little bit about this is on our review team were Julia and Amy from Queen Anne's School. They were doing a lot of this with the students and actually teaching them cognitive science, and found that they were really favourable. It was a really beneficial thing for them to have that conversation about learning with the students. So I can't say here's a randomised control or here's some strong evidence to support this, but it feels like a really sensible and high potential thing for us to be doing, I think.
Thank you. So we've got a question from Alex Black. Was a distinction made between cognitive psychology and cognitive science when selecting studies?
So we set out the start of the review and we said that cognitive science, well, it's cognitive sciences, there's lots of things which might be included in cognitive science. But we said the ones which are having the biggest impact at the moment in education were cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience, and its cognitive psychology is primarily the place where retrieval practice, spaced learning, these of course are being studied in both, because you're studying the same phenomena at different levels of analysis in a way, but it was the cognitive psychology which was being more readily translated. So we made that distinction, and in practice a lot of the review was based on the cognitive psychology, because that's where most of the classroom trials have taken place.
There's a few interesting comments in the chat that kind of expand on this previous discussion. So Julia Harrington says, so
this is Julia from the review. Well,
yeah.
Hi, Julia.
I don't know if you want to talk about it yourself.
Oh, yeah, please come in.
But she says, we share the idea of brain plasticity with our students, and it can be a revelation in terms of their feelings about their own learning and what they can achieve. I guess an explanation is good when you if you understand that you can learn. That's helps you kind of point in that direction. Perhaps I don't know if Julia, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah. Yes, just to say, I think we've been running Brain Can Do now for about 7 years. And one of the biggest effects is we find that students, particularly if they felt, oh, well, you know, I can't do this, whatever, that there is this opening of this door that actually, you mean there's something I can do about it, that I'm not stuck as being this student or that student, and then giving them different knowledge of principles. And the same with teachers as well, often taking teachers to that, you know, this child can achieve other things if there are different ways in which you approach their learning and their motivation. So we've been really struck by that. Now, again, we can't directly prove causation. Value added when you come to assessment is much bigger than it should. Those children are pitched in terms of their levels of cognitive, where they've been measured before. But it is work which we find is very productive and we're very proud of. I'll put the Brain Can Do website, but happy for people to contact me if you want more information. I'll put it in the chat now.
So we're approaching 5 o'clock, but Tom has kindly said he doesn't mind sticking around for a little bit longer if anyone else has got any questions at all.
And if I could just add to that, thank you, Julia. And what we, in my view, as an applied researcher, need to do now, and maybe someone from the EEF will hear this, is identify these kind of a promising approach here, and see if we can create a model of it and scale it and do efficacy and effectiveness tests of it. I think That's where we should be going to try and cement some of our understanding. I suspect that across the country, in some schools, for some teachers, there's these pockets of expertise and excellence out there, and we should be looking to try and capture those, trying to make sure they're well aligned with the basic science, because I think some practice will presumably have deviated quite considerably from the basic science. Some of it will be more credible, and we should be trying to capture models of it and scale it and share it.
If I could ask a question, Tom, I thought it was really interesting. You're talking about, the strategies that should be considered within larger teaching frameworks, and that's where, rather than isolated pedagogical kind of processes, is there room for considering these within a broader framework of how the mind learns or the brain learns as well? Because they all seem quite, they're a bit like, how to crack an egg, but don't tell you the rest of the omelette kind of thing. How to make, so they're quite isolated in terms of this is retrieval practice and this is spaced learning, but they're not linked together. You're not sort of, and is that another?
That's really helpful. I think there's lots of ways of sort of delineating things and choosing where the focus is. Earlier I said, well, getting into sort of effective teaching is a good the system to integrate into. And I said for school leaders, it's probably, we're looking at more whole school and professional learning a little bit. But yeah, I would add a few. So it's not just teaching, it's teaching and learning. So I think we talk about teachers having pedagogical knowledge of how to teach, content knowledge of their subject, and pedagogical content knowledge of the knowledge of how to teach their subject. And so there's three frameworks there to put cognitive science in. We have an overview of what teaching looks like. We need to put into that. We have an overview of what an effective school is. We need to put into that. We have good models coming out of what professional development and learning looks like. So we should put it into that. And your point there about integrating it into the model of the mind, yes, I think that's really, really important, because to some extent, one of the things which has been said to me about the review, which is helpful, is that we pulled together lots of things, including things like retrieval practice and space practice. And we've included things which aren't always in the account, things like we've talked about embodied learning and kind of visual approaches. And I know there's lots more which could go into that. So some teachers are seeing a partial account of the cognitive science, and putting it together was helpful. There's also a little bit in the report where we start discussing the links between all the strategies and all the areas, where we say, well, what's the relationship between cognitive load and retrieval practice, and are these linked somehow? And I mean, you can come up with simple things like an incomplete worked example when you're working in cognitive load is an opportunity for retrieval practice, and you make that connection there. So I agree with you here that a more holistic, coherent model of the mind and of learning, which brought these together, would be really powerful for teachers to understand learning and learners to understand learning.
Yeah, it feels like one of the drawbacks or challenges is that lots of these things just don't work all the time, and they're very context dependent. And the mind is one of those contexts, I guess, isn't it? And particularly as it develops. Alex, did you have a question you wanted to ask? We can't hear you.
I can't hear you.
So perhaps while you're sorting out your sound.
Yeah.
Oh, you've got it.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Tom. It was really interesting. I'm particularly interested in, you had the table where you had 0 for retrieval practice. That was 0 studies that fitted your criteria, yeah?
Yeah, that's right.
And your introduction to how retrieval practice, you chose that as almost a recommendation of how it should be kind of put into practice. I thought that was great. But I'm wondering, why is it not risen to the level of the evidence it has in pure cognitive science is really high in applied classroom work? I'm wondering why, because everyone talks about retrieval practice probably more than anything else. Why hasn't it risen to that level to be included in your studies?
So do you mean that the
Well, you said.
Are you asking why the science hasn't been done in a way that's more realistic and applied, and therefore included in the study?
Yeah, because thousands of teachers are doing it. It's kind of the biggest trend, probably the biggest transfer that's got into practice. And I'm just wondering why there hasn't been any large-scale research studies on it. Is it because it's so context specific, the teacher's understanding?
So no, I'd actually say that it's actually almost low-hanging fruit for a good applied trial right now. I think retrieval practice is becoming increasingly widespread in the system. I think that it is something which feels sort of controllable enough to say whether you're doing it or not. When we trial things, we often have to have this treatment condition and a control condition and two distinctness between there. I think it is possible to say we're going to trial this, and I think schools would probably readily take that up. I'd say the reason we haven't done that yet is because some of this is fairly new and there's not necessarily the funding for it. And there are some trials. I think one of the best ones we had in the database was a pilot, I think, by the EEF. So maybe they'll expand that into an effectiveness trial. I think a lot of it comes down to the structure and funding and incentives for doing research that I think it's, I mean, I was very interested actually to watch Daniel Willingham's talk on this seminar series, and he was saying that it was very interesting. He said that it's not really what he's meant to be doing according to his university. He had to get to his tenure and professorship before he could start really going to apply things. And I think I can see and understand those incentives, why we do focus in the basic science and why that might create something more sturdy. But yeah, I think organisations like the EEF, the Department for Education ultimately, and also practitioner researchers are the right ones to start doing these trials and making them work. And I'm starting to see some emerge.
Okay, thanks.
And just to actually follow up as well, I'd say retrieval practice is one of the more simpler ones. I would say some of the cognitive loads ones and dual coding as well, I feel there are some simple ideas, some powerful ideas there, which you can just implement. But I also think there's a lot of expertise needed for some of those. I think there's a lot more of a grey area for some of those in terms of people's practice. So they are probably a bit harder to implement. And the reason why we're losing some of the effect size is the gap between the pure model and all the professional development and learning that's needed, and all the contextual specific decisions teachers need to work through. I think that's where the gap is.
Thanks. So I think we should probably wrap up now, but thanks so much, Tom, for a really interesting talk and lots to think about there. Thanks to everybody who came along and your questions. We'll post a recording on the YouTube channel if you'd like to watch it again, and hopefully you can join us next week. So thank you very much, everyone. Take care. Bye.
It's been a real pleasure. Do feel free to email me, contact me. I'd love to speak to you.